So my name is Hazel Degat. I'm an attorney with the Education Law Center. I practice across all of our programmatic areas. ELC is a statewide nonprofit legal services organization. So we use policy advocacy, impact litigation, direct litigation, and community involvement in order to push for education access and equity for all children in Pennsylvania. We really use a variety of different strategies to push for education justice. So I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Essence Kimes, who can tell you a little bit about herself and also her fantastic fellowship.
Thanks, Hazel. Hi, everyone. My name is Essence Kimes. I'm also an attorney with the Education Law Center, but specifically, I'm an Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Education Law Center. My fellowship is a project that's specifically focused on improving educational outcomes for Black girls by ensuring that they have access to culturally responsive and appropriate emotional and learning supports and services, specifically mental health supports. And so, as Hazel mentioned, we do all the different practice areas and focused on community engagement and policy advocacy, direct representation. So those all fall within my fellowship as well. But I also have a narrow focus, which is on Black girls. So that's a little bit about my fellowship project. And I'd love, as Hazel mentioned, to hear where everyone else comes from. If you want to introduce yourselves, please feel free.
If anyone would like to introduce themselves, feel free to unmute and introduce yourself, but also no pressure.
They can unmute, right?
Well, hi, Karen. Are you able to unmute?
I was able to unmute, so I'll jump in here as an education advocate working in Western PA. I'm employed by both Achieva, which is a division of the ARC of Greater Pittsburgh and serves people with disabilities mostly, and Robert Morris University's education department as well, where I work with future teachers, especially in, with an emphasis on special education. So yeah, I'm curious to hear what you all have to say today, and I've been enjoying all of today's sessions. So thanks to you both for hosting.
I'll go. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanisha McLean. I am a senior at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. I'm actually interning with the Mon Valley Initiative Curtin Cares branch. And I also have a daughter who was born prematurely, and she is now school age, and she has been involved in like early intervention and special education programs since she was born. So I'm just really interested in, you know, hearing what you guys have to say today.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you, and nice to meet you both.
So we'll go ahead and press forward. So we thought today we would do sort of we were told for these fireside chats to not do a PowerPoint, to not essentially bore you guys with a presentation, but to encourage conversation. And we love that because a lot of what we do and sort of the choices we make and the advocacy points that we make is really driven by what the community is telling us. So welcome input as a parent, as an advocate, as a community member, please feel free to jump in. So we basically structured this as a true or false. And so we were going to, you know, put things in the chat or make polls, but it's kind of easy because there's not that many of us. So we'll just press forward that way. So the first sort of true false that we put out there, and you may have seen it in the poll when you first entered, was whether it's true or false that, thanks, Essence, Black girls with a disability have a federal right to receive appropriate supports in schools. And judging by the poll, you guys agree that yes, there is that federal right to receive appropriate supports in schools. So what's interesting is when we're talking about Black girls with disabilities, particularly as lawyers, we look at it as in what are the sort of identities and intersections of identities that give these students very specific protections, right? So we have race that's implicated, we have gender, and we have disability status. And then we have the intersection of all those, and also the recognition that that is not the sum total that makes up all the identities of each Black girl out there, right? So it could also be a Black girl in juvenile justice system with a disability, or experiencing homelessness, and all of those sort of experiences add additional protections. But for today, we're really going to be focusing on that race, gender, disability intersection. And as lawyers, we are always looking to federal and state laws to figure out ways to leverage the power of the law to really push for breaking down barriers and getting the change we want. Some of the federal laws that you may have heard of is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that's going to focus on race, color, national origin, essentially prohibiting discrimination under that federal law. There's the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, which essentially outlaws segregated schools. You've got the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And what's interesting, and this is something that I think not everyone realizes, is in the US Constitution, there is no sort of explicit right to education, which I think a lot of people find surprising. They're sort of like, but isn't education, shouldn't that be one of those fundamental rights? And it was really left up to states. So it's not like a federal edict. We do use, courts have used in, for example, Brown v. Board of Education, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, its Equal Protection Clause saying states, you must provide equal treatment under your law as a way for ensuring equal treatment under education laws. We've also got, for disability, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have, sorry, I'm admitting another person. We have Title IX, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex or gender. We have the Individuals with Disabilities Act, the IDEA, which you may hear us talking about quite a bit today. And what's interesting about the IDEA is while the other laws we talked about are sort of prohibiting that discrimination, the IDEA also requires schools to proactively support students with disabilities and provide them with a free, appropriate public education. So for example, schools have a legal duty to identify students who require special education services. Welcome everyone that's joining us now. We're just kind of going through our first true and false, which you can see up on the screen right now. Schools have a legal duty then to identify students with disabilities, to evaluate them properly, to place them in the least restrictive learning environment. That means they're not to segregate students with disabilities into their own classrooms for no reason. And it places limitations on the kinds of discipline that you can impose on students with disabilities, particularly when the action that the student has taken is a manifestation of their disabilities. So there are a lot of places where schools can be doing a much better job to ensure that Black girls with disabilities are able to thrive and feel safe. And today, some of the common themes that you'll be hearing is the need to, particularly when we're thinking about disproportionality, we're thinking about the identification of Black girls with disabilities, with the identification as Black girls as having a disability that requires special education, We may be talking about the placement of Black girls with disabilities, meaning where do they receive their education? And we'll be talking about discipline issues. So we can, unless there are any questions, we can now get into some of the heart of what we're here to talk about today with sort of that legal framework background.
Yeah, and if there are any questions or comments throughout, please feel free to jump in at any time. Just unmute yourselves or feel free to throw it in the chat. I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen, but Hathel, can you still see it?
I can, I'll let you know.
Okay. Yeah, so for this next few true or false, if you want, you can throw your answer in the chat box, and then maybe one of you can help explain your thought process or reasoning for your answers. Feel free, again, to hop in at any time. We're hoping for this to be more of a conversation rather than a lecture, so happy to hear you all's thoughts. So this next true or false. Black girls with disabilities are suspended from school at the same rate as their white counterparts. I'll leave the true and false up for a little bit, and if someone wants to jump in with what they think the correct answer is or any comments on this true or false, please feel free.
No comments in the chat yet. Any thoughts, folks?
I'm gonna say that that is false. I'm gonna guess that that's false.
Thanks, Tanisha. I don't know, Essence, I don't know if you were able to see, that was Tanisha.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts or Tanisha, is that the correct pronunciation?
It's Tanisha.
Tanisha, do you want to elaborate on why you're thinking false?
I don't know. I kind of feel like that not just Black girls, but I kind of feel like Black and brown children are suspended at higher rates anyway. But I feel like when they have disabilities, a lot of times issues are considered to be behavioral problems, and it's not. It's a result of the disability. And instead of trying to get to the root of what it is, they often are, police are called, or, they're handled roughly and they're suspended, and it could have ended differently if the situation was approached differently. So that's just kind of why I'm thinking that this is false.
Yeah, those are great points. Any other comments? Okay. So Tanisha was pretty spot on. This chart is national data that was collected from the Civil Rights Data Collection, and it's a chart that shows the percentage of girls served under the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act who were suspended from school by race. And as you can see, Black girls were suspended at a rate of 18.6%, while white girls with disabilities were suspended only 5.2%. So the answer to that true and false was false. According to the data, students with disabilities in general are more likely to be disciplined than non-disabled peers. However, Black girls with disabilities tend to be more than 3 times as likely to be suspended from schools and disciplined in schools than their white counterparts. And the reasoning tends to be because, biases and stereotypes, especially as it pertains to their behaviors, as Tanisha was mentioning, their behaviors are often viewed as threatening or inappropriate for their age. Meanwhile, it actually could be something that's a manifestation of their disability, or it could just be normal childlike behavior, actually, but they're viewed differently than their white counterparts. And so they tend to be disciplined a bit more harshly. Any comments or thoughts about this chart and this data and looking at the suspension rates? We do see frequently that, higher discipline rates occur also despite the misbehaviors being no different than their white counterparts. So even if it's a student with a disability, who's misbehaving, that misbehavior could be the same from a white student, yet they're treated and disciplined differently.
And in our role as lawyers, we often come into situations where parents are calling and saying that their child is being disciplined for a behavior that the school knows that their child does and for which they're receiving special education services. I mean, in our role, we're sort of saying, well, then the program that you have set up for this child is not working. So that's really a place that we need to be looking. Why is this child engaging in that behavior? There are things such as functional behavior assessments, which can be done to really get to the root of why, what are the triggers for a certain behavior that a child is engaging in, and what are the ways that type of trigger can be avoided, and that if a child is in a space where they are already triggered or engaging in behavior that is harmful to himself or herself or others, the question is, what are the various things that we can do? What are the solutions that schools can try in order to make sure that that child doesn't end up in that place? Or if they are in that place, how do they get out of that place? As one example, we had a parent whose child had an emotional disability, a social and emotional disability, and as part of the child's IEP, they had added that when he was feeling uncomfortable and felt like he was being too crowded, then they would take him to another room and sit with him one-on-one and try to talk to him or put him in a small group. And the parent said, when he's in that situation, he would like to be alone. He would like to just sit by himself and have some space, right? And that was a disconnect, and the school wasn't listening to what the parent knew her child needed in order to avoid these behaviors. That is talking about sort of like our role in what we do in trying to make sure that kids have the appropriate program. But as we'll talk later on, the program in essence will provide more data and information that certainly doesn't account for the differences in race and the disproportionality in terms of discipline.
Yeah, and just to add to one of Peto's points, schools often have certain protections and accommodations when it comes to students with disabilities, especially students in special education. However, these accommodations and these supports are often really used for the white students, and these same protections aren't quite afforded to the Black students. So we're seeing disparities within that as well. So I'm going to move on to our next true and false.
There was a comment in the chat that was just put in saying from Andrea Best McCleary, saying that some schools allow the child to be disciplined within the school systems.
Yeah.
I would like to elaborate on that because what I really mean.
I'm so sorry. You somehow have an echo.
Yeah, I don't know why.
You want to try again?
Yes, because you sound echoey to me. Oh, wow.
We all mute. Okay, I'm gonna mute my screen and then you go ahead, Andrea.
Andrea, did you want to try again? Okay, I think there will be more opportunities. I think we're gonna be touching upon discipline again. So we'd love to hear what you have to say, Andrea. Also, doing it again. I'm so sorry. Or you could put it in the chat.
I'm gonna try to see what. I'll try to see what's happening here.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry that's happening. I'm not sure why we're getting that echo. Oh, it looks like there's two Andrea Best McCleary's logged in. So that could be where the echo is coming in. Maybe one of those needs to be signed out. But I'd love to hear more about that point when we can figure out the audio issue.
How this help?
We're still having the feedback and the echoing.
How?
I'm sorry, Andrea. You'll probably have to close one of the screens. Oh, she might have left one of them, so it might work. No, she still has two screens open. All right, Essence, do you want to go to the next true false? And Andrea, we'll keep trying to get you on.
Can everyone see this okay? Can you hear me okay? No echo?
Yes.
Okay. So this next true and false, Black girls are often over-identified as students with disabilities. So again, feel free to just comment or in the chat your answer or thoughts around this. We'd love to hear from you as well if you want to just jump in and comment out loud. Any thoughts on this one that anyone would like to share?
Christy Troutman shared in the chat, I think it's mixed, right? Some diagnoses are really delayed or missed. Others are pathologized.
Thanks for sharing, Christy. Anyone else? Okay, well, just to go off of Christy's comments, It does depend, and it is almost a mix that we see. We do see a lot of Black students and Black girls being over-identified in special education, but then there's also instances and times when there's the under-identification. This chart shows the percentage of girls served under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act by race. And as you can see, Black girls make up the highest number at 9.2%. And this is 2013 and 2014 data. So admittedly, this data is not the most updated. There is a huge need for a larger data collection, a more updated and more recent data collection. However, we have seen these numbers just continue to grow over the years as well, looking back at previous data. And some of the reasons that over-identification, especially in terms of Black students and Black girls, happens is just the cultural responsiveness that's lacking within education. So a lack of understanding of Black students and their needs, especially Black girls. Teachers aren't exactly reflective of the student body. So, you know, a lot of our Black girls are in schools without any Black educators, especially not Black women. And so these are a couple reasons why it shows that students with Black students are often over-identified. It also could be due to their behaviors being read as a need for special education, whereas this could be, in other instances, especially with their white counterparts, deemed as just normal childlike behavior. But when it comes to Black students and Black girls, it's viewed as they're, you know, now needing evaluated, or their discipline is such a problem that we're pushing them into other programming. Were there some comments in the chat?
Yes, just so everyone knows, when Essence is presenting, she can't always see the chat. That's why I'm reading your chat to her. So Christy Troutman actually talked about what you and I have been discussing, Essence, and that you touched upon, which is, she said, first, this chart is interesting. Do you know more about types of disabilities? And then she said, I think a lot of behaviors that are manifestations of trauma are pathologized, particularly for students of color.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I think that's spot on. I do think that when it comes to trauma with Black students, schools are unaware of how to address these needs because they're lacking the proper resources, especially when it comes to being culturally responsive to the need. Schools and administrators, teachers even aren't fully understanding, you know, the children that they're teaching, just due to kind of the cultural barriers. And there's a lack of like willingness to address that. A lot of the response is just to, again, push the children either out of the school systems or into these special education programs based off of not fully understanding why a child may be acting out that day, or the fact that they may actually be dealing with trauma and just have a need for emotional support rather than learning support. So we see it on both ends though, right? Because as you also mentioned, Christy, it does happen where students are also under-identified for special education. And that happens when, you know, schools fail to recognize that a child's not just having a behavioral issue just because, right? They're not just acting out, and, you know, schools are quick to label them as bad seeds and, you know, want to just jump straight to disciplining rather than actually investigating, figuring out what the needs of the child are. And so in those instances, we can see some under-identification of special education.
And
anyone have any further comments? Oh, sorry, Hazel.
no, please. Anyone else before I add? I just wanted to emphasize Essence's point, and that what Christy brought up, which is sort of, can we get more data that would be helpful in understanding what a lot of Black girls and their families know it's happening in schools in terms of under-identification, over-identification, the placement of Black girls with disabilities. We need a lot more data that is intersectional, that really gets to the heart of what is this intersection between race, gender, and disability, because without that information, it's hard to know how to target the disproportionality. And the other point I'll say is that, their parents can ask for an evaluation for special education, of course. But often it's schools who are the gatekeepers as well, and teachers who are the ones who are deciding whether or not a student should be evaluated for special education, for eligibility for special education. And so with that understanding, it's the teachers that need to be more diverse. They've got to be able to understand our Black girls in a way that they can better differentiate whether a behavior might be due to a disability or might be due to the fact that the school environment is not a safe and welcoming space.
Yes, and I think, again, school discipline really ties into this and their procedures, given certain behaviors, Black students tend to be more likely to be referred to special education programs for their behavioral issues. And I do believe that teachers in schools fail to recognize the kind of inherent bias in it and their treatment of students differently. But I do think like once that's recognized and acknowledged, then we can start to realize that, these students may not need to be pushed into these other programs, just due to certain behaviors. They just might have a need for other supports in schools, like just speaking to counselors more frequently or school therapists. Just because there may be a need for that doesn't mean that they need to be in special education programs. So does anyone else have any other comments on this point? Okay, we'll jump to the next true or false then.
Since Christy added in the chat, that reminds me of ACLU's powerful findings about how many schools have cops but no counselors.
Yes, and cops not counselors. It's alarming that we see so many districts and so many schools that have such a focus on school police and school security, surveillance, and they're underfunded when it comes to school counselors and emotional supports in the schools for students. Even in Pittsburgh public schools, where they kind of honestly have some of the highest rates of referrals to law enforcement, where students experience their first encounter with school police. And so it is alarming, especially given the fact that, these school police and surveillance and all of that, is not actually proven to be helpful to the students or providing safety as, they claim. And unfortunately, it means that students are now lacking the proper supports that they need.
Hello, am I echoing now?
No, it sounds great. I'm so happy.
Okay. So I can relate to some of the things that are being said because I have a granddaughter who has autism and who's experienced some things. What I will say is just watching what my daughter went through with my granddaughter being a young Black girl. She's 10 and she that's her disability. And what I noticed, it's almost like if the parents are cooperative, it's like they get better treatment. But if if the school can't work with the parents, it seems like that's where the ball kind of can get dropped. But if parents are cooperative, because my daughter has always been cooperative with services for my granddaughter inside the school, services provided inside the school. It's like my granddaughter got excellent treatment. So I've never seen, any disparity that, or inequities with her, on this level, when we're talking about the kids in school and, different things like that. But I will also say, I remember other parents because I was a mother young, go through things where, if they weren't involved, the kid, acted out more and didn't get the proper treatment. Do you understand? You guys understand, what my point with that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it depends, right? So I do think that there are instances where, school will be willing to work with parents and provide, proper supports, but we do see instances where, even the parent is trying to do everything they can to get their child services, they're still, struggling to kind of get that connection and get those supports for their child. So, I think it just depends on the circumstances. And another issue that we see is just the fact that a lot of families are just lacking knowledge and awareness of their rights when it comes to special education and their students' rights. And so a lot of families are unsure of what to even ask the school for, or that their child even has rights when it comes to their education. And so that's another barrier that comes up in terms of students not receiving proper supports, is that schools kind of should take the lead on this at times, but as Hazel mentioned, they can be, parents and families can ask for an evaluation, but the schools can also, say to the family, hey, I see your child struggling, maybe we can do something to work together. But oftentimes families may not even realize that's an option. So,
you know what? I can relate to that, because my grandkids actually just switched school districts. And coming from one school district to another, I noticed that Gateway School District, that's the first thing they do when you get to this district is, find out where you're at, see if there's any type of services. So, I think it varies throughout the different school districts. With that, or just trying to get an assessment of the kid from the beginning when they enter, being aware and being aware of, where the disability may come in at, or, maybe parents are entering the district that's not even aware that their kid even has a disability. But it's like, I know out here in Gateway School District, they do an assessment and they pick up on stuff really quickly. And I think, getting a grasp on that early may make a difference as well, so it does make a difference.
Yes, agreed.
Okay.
Any other comments? I appreciate you sharing.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're going to jump into this next true or false. So again, feel free to jump in with your comments, questions, thoughts about this in the chat, or just unmute yourself. This next one is: schools often treat Black girls in ways that are not appropriate for their age, race, gender, or disability.
Christy has added a true in all caps.
Thanks, Christy. And if you or anyone else want to jump in as to why you may think that's true, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll try unmuting and see if I have the feedback problem. Is it okay?
It's okay.
Okay, great. One of the examples that really has stuck with me is around dress code violations. I've heard so many stories of Black girls being treated differently for wearing essentially the same outfit that white girls are wearing who are not disciplined. And then the ways that discipline around dress code is treated in schools, especially for girls of color, is often very sexualizing in incredibly inappropriate shaming ways. So that's one thought.
Yeah, those are all great and valid points. Thank you so much for sharing. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Or examples, concerns?
What about, this thing with, African American girls with wearing even different color hair weaves or even, hair wraps on their hair in school, or even some schools not approving a kid because they have dreads, So, that's been, some topics that I've read in social media and different, articles and different things like that. So, I've seen that happen before in my personal experiences, professionally and personally. So I think that that's another way. That's one of my thoughts with this.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that as well. Again, all good points. Anybody else? Well, to both of those points with Christy and Andrea, absolutely right. So yes, this is absolutely true. Schools do often treat Black girls in ways that are not appropriate for their age, race, gender, or disability. Schools often adultify Black girls, and adultification bias occurs when, Black girls are viewed more like adults and less innocent than their peers, especially their white peers. So as Christy mentioned, it could be that a Black girl is wearing a similar dress to a white girl, yet it's the Black girl that's being over sexualized and disciplined for wearing that particular type of clothing. And we do frequently see this issue come up in school policies, such as dress code policies, where there will be sometimes explicit language in there that is biased towards certain body types, especially certain hair types. And it's clear that there's just a racially charged, or it's a race motivated policy that's intended to exclude or address Black girls in particular. So we do see things like no tight fitting clothing, or neat hairstyles, which just kind of automatically implies no natural hair, right? So these are the type of things that are actually written in certain school codes and school dress code policies. And we've had examples within the Education Law Center of parents who call us with school discipline issues due to their child showing up to school with a piercing, or one student was wearing a headband with a wig on, and that violated the school dress code policy. And again, these are things that students should be able to freely wear and freely do, especially in order to express themselves or their culture, their identity, yet they're essentially being shamed at school for just being themselves, and often told that it's inappropriate for being themselves.
And it's these dress code violations that are the catalyst then for often a Black girl saying, this is me, this is my identity, this is what I look like. And then they're disciplined for talking back or getting aggressive, because that's the impression that the teacher gets. So for example, for the family that called in, daughter had a nose piercing. Not even sure how they were seeing it because the kids have to wear masks, but they saw it. She was called out for it, and she stood up for herself and said, this is part of my identity. And they are trying to, on that basis alone, refer her to an alternate education program in week 2 of school.
For disruptive youth.
Right. For essentially talking back. And, you know, the same thing happened with the young woman who was wearing a headband to sort of cover the roots of where her wig was. And that's very, very sensitive. It's very personal. And they were basically telling her, you need to get that off or you can go home. And again, she pushed back in a way that the school felt was not respectful. And she was subject to exclusion from school then.
Yeah, and we do see often that, you know, teachers and school staff will, you know, determine what's inappropriate or, you know, what's a violation at times. You know, we don't always see explicit, you know, racist codes, but oftentimes how the policies are applied are discriminatory and you know, we see the disparities. And it's, you know, the example that Hathel just gave, you know, students standing up for themselves, if it's a Black girl, may be viewed as threatening and in the teacher's eyes warrant some sort of punishment or discipline. Whereas if a white student were to stand up for themselves or speak out, you know, they may be even applauded or, you know, treated differently, not actually disciplined for it, more so just seen as they're speaking their mind and sticking up for themselves rather than seen as a threat.
And when you think about the example that Essence gave, for example, no tight-fitting clothing. I mean, really, and this goes back to Christy's point, who is policing that? Who is deciding? Who is looking at a young girl's body and deciding that something is too tight for them? I mean, that's what's really alarming here, that those are in dress codes and that everyone seems to have an unspoken agreement of, well, we know what it looks like when the clothes aren't appropriate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think Karen just mentioned this. It's very subjective, right? It's and it's also based on negative stereotypes. You know, people are quick to label, especially Black girls, as angry, aggressive, hypersexual. And that tends to lead them to treat these girls in inappropriate ways, right? You know, these are kids that we're talking about at the end of the day, yet they're viewed and looked at as sometimes older than they are. And again, it's just in an inappropriate way. Any other comments or examples that you all may have seen where this kind of occurs in schools or even outside of schools?
And in the chat, Karen says, there's a lot of subjectivity in the application of policy. She says it's an unacceptable level of scrutiny. And Christy points out that no one says that boys' clothes are inappropriate or too tight.
Right, yeah, and that's another thing we see is it's that the dress codes are very, very specific when it comes to the girls' clothing and hairstyles and all of that. But yeah, it's not, there's less attention given to the boys, which is definitely a problem. But it definitely should not be left to the schools to decide whether or not, you know, a student is wearing something that's too tight or, you know, that shouldn't be the focus, right? I see we're coming up on time. So I'm going to move to the next true or false if there's no more comments on this one. All right, so schools have a duty to protect Black girls from racial discrimination, sexual harassment, and discrimination based on disability. Feel free to throw your answer in the chat. Any comments on this one? Anyone want to jump in to talk about their thoughts?
And Christy put in the chat, yes. In all caps again, someone should tell them, especially board members.
Agreed. This one is absolutely true. Schools do have a duty to protect Black girls from racial discrimination, sexual harassment, and discrimination based on disabilities. But unfortunately, as we mentioned, schools often disproportionately apply school policies to Black girls, which tends to lead to racial discrimination. We talked about dress codes being targeted to Black girls and over-sexualizing Black girls. But in addition to, disproportionate application of school policies, schools often have such racially driven, language and dress code policies that we mentioned. And students are often disciplined, especially Black girls, based on the fact that they're just not free to be themselves, especially Black girls with disabilities who already experience substantial barriers in education, such as insufficient attention, disproportionate discipline, maybe sexual abuse and violence, and other seclusion from schools. And so when you merge this with the fact that they're also just overly disciplined and school policies are disproportionately applied against them, it's unfortunate to see that this all can lead to like school push out, dropout rates, and things like that, because it's just kind of schools are just not really the safest place when it comes to Black girls, especially Black girls with disabilities. Any thoughts or comments?
Can I add to that point? This is Christy. I feel like schools are also in the process of teaching Black girls what they should expect from the world and teaching all other students how to treat Black girls through example in terms of the sexualization, the ignoring complaints of sexual harassment or blaming girls instead of failing to provide support for disability. It's like we're modeling racist behavior.
Absolutely. And it definitely comes in the school curriculum, right? With what's being taught to schools, like you mentioned, Christy, with what's being taught to students, it's like they're preparing them for racial discrimination and harassment and all of these things, when in actuality, they should be teaching everyone how to be more inclusive and, less racist. So I think that's a really good point. Any other thoughts?
And we talked about a bit in the beginning about the different federal laws that are out there that are really prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, and in some cases on sex as well as sort of the federal laws that are out there that not only prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability, but also put that responsibility on schools to also provide students with disabilities with a free, appropriate public education. And we really lean on that a lot. And what we've been trying to do more and more in our work at ELC is acknowledge that intersectionality, and that it's not just students with disabilities, but it's also, there are going to be different barriers for Black girls with disabilities. And how do we, as lawyers, Essence and I, leverage the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to ensure that schools are doing what they should be doing to make sure that they're more welcoming spaces for Black girls with disabilities. And kind of the points that I mentioned earlier of making sure that they are identified and evaluated in culturally competent and appropriate ways, to make sure that they are placed in the least restrictive environment so that we are not de facto segregating our Black girls with disabilities into other classrooms or other schools. And that we are acknowledging when a Black girl with a disability acts out for a reason that is related to their disability, and that they are not punished for that type of manifestation of their disability, which is sort of a legal term that the IDEA brings up and says, schools, you can't do this. And it's really a powerful tool. It's not perfect, the IDEA, but I think it's wonderful that it was passed at all, and has given us a really good tool to use, and at least to begin to make schools a safer place for all students, and a place where they can thrive and feel joy.
This is Karen. If I can just ask, I wonder if anyone has ever tried to add training for the school team around, some of these issues into an IEP, the same way that we would add, training on a certain instructional piece or a type of particular curriculum. I'd be curious to know if anyone has tried to get some of these social, emotional, or cultural things baked in and leverage the IEP in that way.
You know what? I've never tried to put it in IEP itself, but that is a fantastic idea.
Yeah, it is.
That is fantastic. We have in settlement agreements with schools required that staff be given professional development training on issues such as disproportionate punishment of students with disabilities. But in terms of putting it in the IEP itself, I think that is fantastic, Karen. That is definitely something I would want to think about.
I think that in the cultural competency aspect, making sure you're being responsive to the actual students' needs, both culturally, emotionally, I think all of that should be written in IEPs. Because I do think that's a big issue, especially when it comes to protecting Black girls in schools, is the fact that they don't have folks there who actually understand their needs.
We might be getting a timing warning.
Oh.
Feel free to wrap up and give people a break. They can network on Nearpod if they want to, and everyone should join the 3 p.m. session from the WOVA agenda. So, Essence, I don't know if you want to wrap us up.
Okay. Sure, I will wrap up. I'll just show you guys quickly the last true or false. Black girls are denied educational opportunities because they are Black and they're girls. And so the answer to that is true. Things like Black girls aren't given as many opportunities to be in gifted programming and accelerated school classes and things like that, all because they're not viewed as the white students are in their classrooms, and as if they're able to excel and succeed in the same way or go down that same path, But thank you all for joining our fireside chat. Thank you for the discussion. It was nice to actually meet everyone and hear your thoughts and learn a little bit from you all as well. So thanks for joining us. Thanks, Karen.
All right, thanks all. Enjoy the rest of the summit.
Yes, 3 p.m. I believe is the next session.
Go grab a snack.
Right.
Thank you, ladies, for hosting. You guys did a wonderful job. We really appreciate you doing this, and great way to wrap up and ask people to come back at 3. So thanks for handling.